Well, those of you who have had the chance to read our monthly newsletter might have been thinking that last week was the final week of the Choose Your King series. When I was asked that recently by a friend, they were relieved to hear that we had one more week left. After all, if we'd finished with my sermon last week, it really would have finished on quite a downer. King David, after 11 years, seemed to have finally resolved the events that transpired after the day when he put his own desires above others. But it left him in a state of deep grief, and his people reeling in the aftermath of a civil war. He'd certainly cast a dark shadow over God's people and his reign. As David entered into Jerusalem, his victory against Absalom, it turned into mourning. Mourning for his son Amnon, for his daughter Tamar, for Bathsheba and her husband Uriah, for his people. It was a mourning and weeping of deep grief, in which he could only blame himself. But as David mourned, his people mourned with him. The events ultimately brought David back to the place where he belonged, both as God's chosen leader of his people, their shepherd, and also as God's servant. The last few chapters of the books of Samuel detail David once again leading the charge in skirmishes between God's people and the other nations. The stories which are recorded in the last few chapters, they almost act as credits, outlining the nature of David's kingship as a warrior, a king who lived by the sword. But in the stories, there's also a clue, or a reminder of the king that David was trained to be, Israel's first shepherd and king. We're reminded of David's role as shepherd and king as he finally takes the responsibility for his actions in the final chapter in the book of Samuel, where he takes the responsibility of his actions upon himself, and he says to the Lord in 2 Samuel chapter 24 and verse 17, "I am the one who has sinned and done wrong, but these people are innocent as sheep. Let your anger fall against me and my family." These words act as a resolution to David straying away from God, and they re-establish the picture of David as the shepherd. They might remind you of David's training as a shepherd. When the prophet Samuel was looking for the Lord's anointed king of Israel, he came to David's family home of Jesse. And as the prophet looked across David's brothers, he looked at them and thought certainly they fitted the looks of a great leader. Surely they were the Lord's anointed. But the Lord told the prophet Samuel that they were not his anointed. The Lord said to Samuel, "Don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him." The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. It turns out that God's chosen king of Israel was in the wild, protecting the family's sheep and goats, their very livelihood. A shepherd who spends day and night, who lives with the sheep, guiding them with his voice and protecting them with his very life. At night, he would literally lie across the entrance to their sleeping place with a staff in one hand and a sling in the other, ready to fend off any wild animals that want to attack the sheep. This is the training that David, the shepherd, needed as king, which for a time he had sadly forgotten, as rather than protecting his sheep, Instead, he used and abused them. But the books of Samuel do not end with the despair and failure of a shepherd who left his watch and returned to find his sheep had gone astray and no longer trusted his voice. No, it is an ending of grace and new beginnings. Back in Jerusalem, as David mourned for all that he had done and lost, Joab the commander appeared to rebuke him harshly, as he said to him, "We saved your life today, and the lives of your sons, your daughters, and your wives and concubines. Yet you act like this, making us feel ashamed of ourselves. You seem to love those who hate you, and hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that your commanders and troops mean nothing to you. It seems as if Absalom had lived and all of us had died, that you would be pleased. Now go out there and congratulate the troops, for I swear by the Lord, if you don't go out, not a single one of them will remain here tonight. Then you will be worse off than ever before." Joab's words might have seemed a bit harsh, and perhaps his years of war had eroded his ability to use tact. But what he said was ultimately what David needed to hear. Joab knew that despite David's responsibility for the fall of Israel into chaos and the deaths of so many, his mourning, his drawing into himself, it had to end eventually. Because as David mourned all he had lost, he failed to notice all those that were left, all those that he was responsible for. You see, we can either live our lives in self-loathing and inaction, licking the wounds of our mistakes and hurts, or we can accept God's grace and recognize everything that we have left. Tony Cartledge writes concerning life's depressions, "They do not mark the end of life, only a new beginning. With faith and courage and grace born of God, believers can learn to face even the deepest agony of grief with hope, and to let that sorrow become strength for days yet to come." The scriptures say, following Joab's rebuke of David, "So the king went out and took his seat at the town gate, and as the news spread throughout the town that he was there, everyone went to him." It's an amazing image, which brings us back to the scene of Absalom, who used the gates as the point that he would start his threat to the throne. It's at the same gate that as David finally accepted God's gift of a new beginning, that God's people accepted David. David's story continued through his and Bathsheba's son Solomon, who ascended the throne after David. As David was coming to the end of his time on earth, he said to his son, which we'll find in 1 Kings chapter 2. He said, "Observe the requirements of the Lord your God and follow all his ways. Keep the decrees, commands, regulations, and laws written in the law of Moses, so that you will be successful in all you do and wherever you go. If you do this, then the Lord will keep the promise he made to me. He told me, if your descendants live as they should, and follow me faithfully with their heart and soul, one of them will always sit on the throne of Israel." Today, we come to the communion table to remember one of David's descendants who followed God faithfully with all his heart and with all his soul, who lived his life as the perfect example of a shepherd. The King of Kings, who has established a new kingdom in which he reigns from his throne. Can it be a coincidence that hundreds of years before he was born, events transpired in such a way that they relentlessly, even supernaturally, made preparations for a coming Saviour in the line of David, who is fulfilled in a man, the son of a carpenter, called Jesus? Well, I'll leave that up to you to decide as we come to his table, as we enter into his hospitality, as we come to his table where he has set aside a place for you. You have been invited to that place, but all you have to do is accept Jesus into your heart and accept him as your Saviour and your King in your life.